My dad is a Marine. My dad, Devin LaFomboy, is a Marine. He entered the Marines in 1997 and was sent to Camp Pendleton, California. He was in the infantry. He learned how to use all sorts of weapons and how to be ready to go in and fight if the country needed him. If anything happened, he was one of the first ones to go in. One of the things my dad told me about was when he helped with Operation Defense Response and aid in Yemen after the USS Cold was bombed. He had to guard it for 21 days. My dad said because of becoming in the Marines, he learned to be a better man. He learned to be a better person.
This is my grandfather, Nathan Pierce. He was in the Navy during World War II and served in Idaho, San Diego, and then spent much of his 2.5 years in the South Pacific and Korea. My grandmother said he willingly signed up for the war after Pearl Harbor was bombed. He believed in the war and said he'd always rather fight in other countries in the hopes of keeping it off American shores. At that time he already had a wife and 5 kids, and he wanted the war as far from them as possible. Nathan also worked for the U.S. Border Patrol for a couple years after his time in the Navy, and during that time he was stationed with his family at Fort Missoula.
My Uncle Eldon is in Nottingham. My Uncle Eldon Humphrey left high school and entered the Army when he was 18. He worked at Fort Carson in Colorado running a road guarder until he was deployed to Iraq as a part of Iraqi freedom. His group of soldiers were some of the first to the country. He said being in the military was much different than just watching the news to get an idea of what was going on. For people here in America, the war was something that is going on somewhere else. It doesn't really matter to many of them, but to people in Iraq and those kids, that's their life. When the war started, their whole world changed. To see people, it actually it changes your part of the world. That was my favorite part, being a part of changing someone's world for the better. I'm proud of my uncle for serving our country.
This is my grandfather, Lamar Humphrey. He was hauling coal in Idaho when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and shortly after he was drafted into the Army. He volunteered for the Air Corps and soon became a gunner, running the .50 caliber machine gun on a B-17. Throughout most of his time in combat, he was stationed in England. They bombed Germany from Gibraltar. He remembered combat as cold and scary. His plane was often hit with anti-aircraft shells. He always made it back after missions, but sometimes it took a couple of tries. Sometimes they'd run out of gas. Sometimes their maps that told them where they could land were unclear, since they seemed to be changing every day with the Germans continually bombing their landing sites. Many of the people he flew with didn't make it back at all. He told me he knew he needed to be there, but mostly what he thought about was getting the job done so he could get home. He was 18 and 19 when he was in the war. The soldiers he was living and working with were about the same age. It was really hard for all of them to be so far from home, and he thought it was really hard on his parents too. He thought this was a war that we needed to fight, but he really believed that young people and those making decisions about war should do everything they can to avoid it. If you haven't experienced a war, he told me, it's really hard to comprehend how bad it really is. Sometimes you're forced into it, but once you start, where does it end?
My papa, Michael Humphrey, was born in Glasgow, Montana, October 2nd, 1952. He graduated from St. Ignatius High School in 1970 and joined the Navy. One thing that I thought was funny was his stories of basic training. He said, "Basic training was my first experience of the military. It was 12 weeks, and it seemed much longer. It was endless harassment, pointless busyness, and hilarious company commanders trying to seem scary. We learned to march and keep straight faces when grown men threw tantrums and yelled in our faces." He didn't think that the war he was a part of was one we needed to fight. But he also said, "I do think that sometimes war is necessary. If good people won't fight, then bullies and thugs will run the world. People who only respond to force need to be stopped by force. I don't think there are lots of them, but they shove their way to the top and cause vast troubles. They are always trying, and they care about nothing but force. I would not be a part of war again because somebody waved a flag and spoke of patriotic things. But I would fight if I believed that someone's freedom, not just my own, not just America's, could be won. Freedom is worth fighting for."